Hello, everyone. On this episode of the SPOA Housing Policy Series, we'll talk about various challenges faced by small property owners, the lack of support available to them, and what we can do to make things better. One of our panelists works with a group that supports small owners who are low income and who reside at their rental properties. While it's important to support this group, it's also important to remember that the majority of small property owners don't fall into that category. You see, tenant activists will try to put out their own definition of what a small property owner is. And they will tell you that a small owner has to live inside the rental property and that the owner can only have no more than, let's say, 3 to 6 rental units. In reality, though, small owners are not defined by the number of units that they have or whether they're owner occupied, but rather by the way in which they do their work, either on their own or with a small group of people, making themselves directly available to their tenants in a hands-on way. There's a big difference between that model and the large mega organizations like BlackRock, Vanguard, or Avalon Bay, perhaps, who have multiple offices with multiple managers and personnel across many buildings throughout the United States and even other countries throughout the world. So it really comes down to the size, the reach, and the complexity of your business structure, as opposed to how many units you own. And so therefore, there's a whole big space in the middle between those two definitions. Within that space is where you'll find the majority of small property owners, and that's the large space that tenant activists want you to ignore. As a big tent organization, SPOA is committed to defending the rights of all property owners, hoping to get to a point where we will all be defined and judged by the way we behave, rather than whether or not we fall into the owner camp versus the tenant camp. I hope you'll stick with us for the duration of the conversation. We'll also give you some legislative updates, including very good news. Hello, everyone. My name is Amir Shahsavari. I'm the Vice President of the Small Property Owners Association, also known as SPOA. We'd like to welcome you to episode 8 of our series about housing policy and property rights. I'm excited to welcome back Ms. Jordana Greenman. Jordana is an attorney who represents small property owners, and we're glad to have her back. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And we have Ms. Joanna Allison. Joanna is the Executive Director of the Volunteer Lawyers Project, also known as the VLP. This is an organization that supports small property owners, namely small owners who are low income and who reside at their rental properties. Thank you for being with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking all of our members and supporters. We've made tremendous momentum and progress on Beacon Hill. On the 18th of January, a group of us testified at a State House hearing about the governor's housing bond bill. At that time, we supported aspects of it, like the creation of accessory dwelling units, also known as ADUs, and we came out against the proposed transfer tax. When we opposed the transfer tax, we were going against the tide at that time. But thanks to all of you who contacted your representatives, we now know that the transfer tax was not included in the House version or the Senate version of the bill. So we've made tremendous progress. We owe it to all of you. Thank you so very much. What this proves is that when we stick together and make our voices heard, we can make a difference. But having said that, we're not out of the woods yet, because the legislative session does not end until the end of this month, and various other proposals can still pop up out of the woodwork. When it comes to tenant right of first refusal, also known as TOPA, which stands for Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, it passed in the House. It didn't go anywhere in the Senate, but that doesn't mean that it's dead. It's still very much alive. Recently, we put out email notices about this. I also had an article published in Banker and Tradesman. You can find it on our website, www.spoa.com. And with regard to the proposal about restricting credit checks on potential tenants, that may have hit an obstacle, but that's still very much alive. And there's another proposal out there regarding broker fees. And so for all the brokers watching, we encourage you to keep an eye on that and to remain vigilant. Speaking of our website, it's important for all of you to keep supporting us and to donate to SPOA. You can do that by going to spoa.com/join. Again, www.spoa.com/join. As volunteers, we take great pride in fighting the good fight to support property rights, but we can't do it without your help. And I think the progress that we've made recently highlights that. But if you keep in mind all that we do, we send you email updates. We get articles published in the mainstream media, in papers like Banker and Tradesman and the Boston Globe. Recently, we've, over the past few years, we've been in the New York Times. We've written columns, collectively speaking. We've given interviews to reporters. We've been on the TV news. We bring you newsletters of our own on a monthly basis. We bring you this webinar/podcast series. So it's our pleasure to do it, but we need you to be engaged and involved. So please remember to donate at spoa.com/join. The bills that I mentioned, we've mentioned them not only on our website, but in previous episodes. But again, we can incorporate all of that into the conversation today. So we're focusing on small property owners and the challenges they face and the lack of support available to them. Jordana, I'll turn it over to you and I'll let you take it away. I mean, I know that we hear the tenant perspective in most cases, but the challenges that property owners go through, mainly small property owners, don't get covered enough. So what should people know that they're not hearing enough?
That is absolutely the case. And it's a really tough thing because unfortunately the law does not differentiate. And it should. There's one quirky thing, where if you're the owner of a 1 to 3 family and you live there, the 93A Consumer Protection Act is not applicable to you. That doesn't really, in practice, help very much. It's because when you're a homeowner and you're behind in your mortgage payment because your tenant isn't paying, the fact that they can't sue you for triple damages isn't really helpful to you on a very day-to-day basis. I wish that people could understand, just take it easy sometimes on people, because there's a lot of people who are in dire straits and they're in that place because of being nice and being patient and trying to work with people. And the qualifications, as far as I understand, when Joanna's program was available, the standard was very high. I mean, you had to really have almost no money. And if you own a property, you have something. So it's very hard to qualify for assistance just because you have a house. And navigating the system, I would say even the most experienced landlords should not be going to court without an attorney these days. It's just not really safe. There's so many little idiosyncrasies that can be missed that can be completely fatal. And even just today, I had a situation with a lovely couple who had rented their single family house, and the tenant and her family moved in. He got kind of concerned when the rent wasn't being paid, so he did himself he called it a 60-day notice, just terminating the lease. So they stopped paying and 2 of them moved out, which turned it into this domino effect of, well, now the head of household can't pay because she was relying on the income from the other people who were there, and their mortgage is going through the roof. They can't really pay it because this is just the situation that they're in. Now they have to pay me. And we did end up settling, which was great. But honestly, they lost about $21,000. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money for the average family to lose. And I don't know how or where the help should come from. I do think that some of it should be done through legislation, and there should be, don't even call it exemptions, but there should be things in place that avoid what happens in an eviction and everybody getting their back up and people who can't afford litigation being stuck in a system with no hope for getting out of it. People buying houses where somebody says, oh, well, we served a tenant the notice. So the average person doesn't know anything about the legal system. They say, oh, well, if they serve the tenant a notice, then I'm sure they'll leave. They buy the house, the people don't leave. And then it's a year and something later, and somebody knows how many tens of thousands of dollars later, and they still don't have their house back because there's enough protection for tenants to survive at least a year in any given case. And so it's hard to say, where should this come from? The legislature should do something. This sort of just ignoring and blindfolding to the fact that there are really people that are providing housing, that are trying to advance the world and help people live, are still being treated the exact same way as the 500 unit building that Avalon Bay owns. It's something that I don't know what the answer is. And with various programs like VLP, I can go and I can dedicate my time for a couple of hours every week. But even the information that exists is not, it's not out there enough. It's not like, you know, for tenants, City Life goes and flyers on people's doors, giving them the number for GBLS, giving them the number for Harvard. Nobody does that for landlords. So I think that we have a lack of activism and a complacence of people who have been through it before and kind of know what to expect and are like, you know what, I just got to deal with this. I got to pay my tenant off to leave and then I got to move on. And each time something like that happens, it becomes harder for that owner occupant landlord.
Hey, you know, we're talking about doing the flyers. We hired a company with some of our grant money to go to the areas in the state that were the highest number of owner occupied landlords, many of them in ethnic areas. And most of the folks never responded or wouldn't open their door to us. So there's a serious lack of trust amongst these folks who've never gotten assistance, who have always felt that there's nobody there for them. And so when you come and say, we're here for you, it feels like a trick. We've been trying to get our information flyers to the court so that they could give it out to landlords who showed up who were pro se, trying to get that information out to them. But that is a big challenge, has been a big challenge for us, and one that we've really attempted to counteract, that idea that there is no one there for me, so therefore I just have to live like this.
Right.
And so I think that this is part of why we're here with SPOA, even though most of the people in SPOA would not qualify if they're, you know, they don't live in the house that they rent out part of, or if they aren't 200% of the poverty level or below. Maybe they know people. Maybe they know folks who are in that situation. Maybe their parents who are owners of 3 families or whatever. They can get that word out to low income, elderly neighbors. You know, it's going to take word of mouth because that's how we're going to get the trust.
I know there's a lot of angst out there too, because there are regulations recently passed, I think, where if an eviction has to occur, when the process begins, the owner is obligated to hand the tenant a form with all of the tenant's rights written there, telling them that they don't have to go, and even probably, you can correct me if I'm wrong, probably telling them where they can access various resources. Now, I'm not opposed to tenants having rights, but who does that for the property owner, really? I mean, what they're essentially doing, what a lot of owners have said, it feels like somebody is handing them the bullet that they have to give to the other side so that they can get shot with that very bullet. You know, it's or someone giving you the shovel that you have to dig your own grave with. And why does the owner necessarily have to go the extra step to inform the tenants of all this when the tenants can do their own research and find, you know, people to represent them? So that's one issue that has come up. But I'm curious to know what the two of you think about that. And Joanna, I just also want to give you an opportunity to talk about what the VLP has been up to more recently and what it plans to do going forward in the near future.
Okay. So I don't know about the new requirement for landlords to give out these warnings to tenants. Do you, Jordana?
Warnings.
Basically, something that he's saying that there's a new legislation that landlords have to let tenants know all of their rights.
Oh yeah, no, what he's talking about is the for the city of Boston, for the city of Cambridge, and the city of Somerville. I don't know where else. you're now supposed to give the tenants that information form at the inception of the tenancy.
Oh, okay.
And when you give a notice to quit. The thing that I've heard only from the judges in the Eastern Housing Court is that they are not going to be enforcing that. If these cities and towns want to put their own little rules into place, they're going to have to enforce it. But it is a problem because it's sort of like, why start off a relationship this way? Hey, I just want to tell you how to sue me. Welcome to my house. The whole thing is so backwards. And it's nobody's fault except for, I think there really is a problem that, the legislators have never gone to housing court 3 weeks in a row and sat there and listened and seen what really happens there. Because it's pretty horrifying. And I think you'd agree with me, Joanna. You listen to these cases, like no matter which side you're on,
It's never a good scene. Either somebody is losing their housing or someone is losing their housing. But for the people that we see, because we don't talk to large landlords. I don't think Jordana represents a lot of large landlords.
I don't.
We're talking to individuals, and it can be a lose-lose situation. And so that sort of brings me to our project. VLP has assisted low-income landlords since the inception of the Lawyer for the Day project. And we did that through the Lawyer for the Day. We also assist tenants. Our hope is that we can have these, the ultimate end of this is that everybody walks away with minimal loss. If it's a tenancy that can be saved, then we figure out a way to save it. If that's through helping them apply for rental assistance, helping the landlord to navigate the rental assistance morass, because it's equally difficult for both sides on that. Helping landlords with mortgage assistance through various programs where people can get assistance with mortgages. But ultimately, there are times, even in our project that sort of looks at ourselves as trying to make things right for both sides, there are times when a person needs to get someone out. They're not going to pay. There's harassment. There's the low-income landlord is going to lose their one chance at having wealth by losing their house. And so in those cases, it is not easy to get someone out. It takes a lot of time. I don't know. Going through these cases, I don't know how a pro se landlord for whom English isn't their first language or who isn't somewhat versed in the law in this area, how they're going to get through this. I don't know how they will navigate such a complicated issue.
Those are good points. And, in the same way that tenants need help understanding how the process works, especially for those tenants who might not speak English as a first language, there are a lot of small owners out there experiencing the same types of challenges, but yet they would struggle to find those resources at this time anyway. And in the past, we've talked about proposing owner-based aid programs. You just mentioned it, Joanna, where the owner would receive assistance from the government directly rather than using the tenants as the intermediaries. I think SPOA has to continue, pushing that proposal. But what do the two of you think? And Jordana, I mean, from a legal perspective and given cases that you've seen, do you think that would make a big difference?
If there were more help?
If not only if there were more help, but if owners could see a new reality where they could receive the help directly instead of waiting for the tenants to receive it and then not being sure if the tenant would then pay the rent to the owner. In other words, streamlining the process.
Yes, I do think it did. But the problem is, in my view, this is my view for what it's worth, the way that the legal services for tenants is set up is to drive a huge wedge between the landlord and tenant. I mean, you are constantly and consistently getting huge packages of information with information that oftentimes is false and made up. And so it sticks this sort of, if you're a landlord and you're upset, you're going from upset to over the hill. And you don't want to be nice anymore. And you don't want to work with somebody because they're just fabricating And that might not always be true. I'm sure that there's obviously some terrible landlords out there, but most of them aren't. And most of them don't have these terrible apartments where people, are really happy living, but they just don't want to pay and they don't have problems until they're taken to court. So, the design, and I don't know if any law students ever got involved in the landlord representation process, but you have these eager beaver students who they hear these stories and they eat it all up and they believe everything they hear, and then there's no room left for negotiation at that point, because nobody just said, hey, look, this is what you want, this is what you want, how can we bring it all together? And by the time you get to court and there's that attempt at mediation, when you're the landlord, if all of this stuff is not true, you don't want to talk about it. You just want your judgment. You just want your house back. Mm-hmm. So I do think having something, I guess, more streamlined and more level of a playing field would be useful. But just that idea of this is housing. So this is an emergency. It's the only thing that's an emergency.
So Amir, back to your question was about the rental assistance landlords being able to apply to that directly. Based on what I have seen in the work that I've done with landlords, it would certainly be helpful if the landlords could make that application, and that would actually be the beginning of an application for RAFT. I mean, they would still have to reach out to the tenant and, make sure that they qualified, because it would have to be a completely different program if it didn't have some qualifications for the tenant to meet. But I do think that having the landlord have some control over that, to have a portal within the RAFT to be able to get in there. And that's one of the things that we worked on in our project, is making sure that landlords had a portal through us that we could go in and see where the problems lay with this money not coming through, see why, know if that money was being given to the tenant and then not being given to the landlord for back rent and things like that. So I do think that would be helpful. I do think that if I'm thinking of RAFT because that's the program that we deal with the most. I feel like if there was an ear there for both sides and it became more of a meeting and a mediation as part of that application, I do think that would work out better and it wouldn't feel so complicated to unrepresented people.
Thank you, Joanna. Yeah, the feedback we also got from RAFT is that, even though we were grateful for the government for providing aid and putting money out there, ultimately, a lot of it didn't get to the property owners who needed it, and they were still, very much behind, very much in debt, very much struggling, facing bankruptcy potentially. I know last time, so there ought to be better ways to streamline it and to do it. Last time when we were speaking to Jordana, she came on with a client of hers who had a tenant living above her. It was a nightmare story where the tenant was committing vandalism, threatening physical harm to the owner and her young daughter, on top of not paying. And I know they got a judgment for possession, and the case is still ongoing. But, I don't think they don't hear it enough. I mean, if you have someone who is willfully not paying and willfully harassing you and causing trouble, on top of that, no pun intended, if you have to live underneath that person as that person damages the top floor, shouts at you and curses at you through the floor on top of other things, that's beyond agony. I don't think I can even put an appropriate word on it. I know that the client that Jordana has, she disclosed it. She talked about pursuing, psychological counseling. And one theme that came out of that conversation was that the system refuses to acknowledge that owners like that exist. And we have to do something to change that. I'll open the floor to the two of you.
Well, I've always said since we started the project in 1999, when a landlord comes to me, I say, go ahead and send that notice to quit. The day the rent is late, send a 14-day notice to quit. Don't wait 6 months. When people are saying to you, well, I'm going to pay it. If they're going to pay it, they will pay it if they have a notice to quit in their hands or if they don't. But you've gone ahead and started your suit to get possession of that. So a lot of times, and I can't talk about percentages because I don't know, but a lot of times people will delay. Somebody will say, look, I'm behind this month, I can't pay, but I can pay next month. And then next month comes and next month comes. And I can say straight up, when you're living hand to mouth and one month suddenly you're doing okay because you didn't pay your rent, the next month it's even harder to pay that rent. So I always suggest to the landlords that I speak to that they start that case immediately. If they don't have to go through with it, they can always enter into an agreement or dismiss it. But if they don't start it, they're behind the 8 ball. They're that much further behind in the rent. And that's how you get like the 21,000 that Jordana was talking about. And I wish I could say to you that 21,000 was the maximum I've ever seen. It is
Me
not.
too. I wish that too.
But the other piece of that is that I also advise tenants, and I say to them, the first thing you need to pay is your rent. The first thing you need to pay is a roof over your head. And when times are tough, there are places to go right away to get some assistance until you can get back on your feet. But it shouldn't be on the backs of these low income, the kind of folks we represent, owner occupied, or, these people who are paying their mortgage with their rent. It shouldn't be on their backs. And so that's sort of everybody's in it. Nobody knows what to do, but money for that to catch up that rent right away, giving it directly to the landlord so that the tenancy can be preserved if there isn't the kind of violence you're talking about, emotional and physical violence. In situations like that, there's no saving that tenancy. And that's what we would advise the landlord in those circumstances. We're not going to save that tenancy. We also know that the vast majority of the time when that's the kind of behavior you're dealing with, going to mediation and they say, oh, I had to be out in 6 months, that's not going to be true. So you need to just come forward with all guns loaded and go ahead and end that tenancy and get your execution. I see a lot of landlords who are don't have a lot of money, but there's no money to help them effectuate the eviction. They can get that judgment, they can get that execution, and then they've got to hire a sheriff, they've got to get a moving company, they've got to put it in storage. It's kind of expensive to evict someone. So that I wish that there were programs that could assist landlords in that final stage, because I've certainly seen them, and I bet you have too, Jordana, where that they didn't have the money to take those final steps. And so they have an execution in hand, it's going to become stale, and they can't afford to do that final move out.
Yes, definitely. And it's heartbreaking. And then the other thing about rental assistance and RAFT and all that is that the idea of it is sort of better than the program in general. There's even programs, I can't remember what the woman program, but there's a woman who contacted me, Family Movement. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, Joanna, but she gets in and she tries to help landlords who are not, I don't know, like I have a client who's probably 77, and my dad knows how to use a computer and he's in his 70s, but this guy is an old school landlord. He has an iPhone 1, he doesn't really have the capability personally to be downloading and uploading documents to the system. So she'll come and she'll come to his house and she'll help him upload all the documents and stuff. There's a lot in place that's helpful to both sides in a way with RAFT, but the problem is then it just sits there, and people who don't check their email every 5 seconds the way that I do might not know. And so a tenant thinks they did everything that they were supposed to do, but they didn't, and they got some email about it and they didn't see it. And then it just keeps going around and around and around. And so I think what Joanna said is particularly important, is that even when you want to be nice, you got to protect yourself. You got to file that case right away, for better or worse, to protect yourself. And because if a less litigious advocate comes and helps the tenant, it's more likely that RAFT application will get pushed through faster when there's somebody else helping. There's a lot of factors that go into it, and it's just, it gets really scary to see what people are really dealing with when you're there all the time, in and out.
That's a powerful, powerful point, because there are people out there who will wonder why the dastardly property owner sends a notice to quit so quickly when a tenant may be struggling And the answer to the question, just based on what the two of you just said, is that they have no other choice because the system is rigged against that owner if they don't act quickly enough to save their businesses and their livelihoods. And it goes back to that human element on the property owner's side that rarely gets talked about. And is it fair to say then that if we did see substantial reform to the point where the legal services people who deliberately, as you were saying, Jordana, who deliberately try to drive a wedge between owners and tenants, if there was more balance in favor of speaking up for the needs and challenges of the property owner, is it fair to say then that the owners wouldn't be as pressured to start the process so quickly because they could rely on a more efficient and balanced system of mediation that would take place sooner to help not only the owner but the tenant as well?
So I am one of those legal services people. I don't usually pay for people, etc. But I'm in legal services, and I don't think that would change things. I think they still need to serve that notice to quit right at the beginning. All of this other stuff can still happen. They can still be nice. They can still get this mediation, get it handled quickly. But until they file that notice to quit, they are sitting back, getting further and further behind in their mortgage. The tenant is getting further and further behind in rent. Are there people who miss 1 month and then they're right, the next month they pay 2? Yeah, we don't see those people. But I still think that no matter what, it behooves you to go ahead and send that notice to quit. Let the tenant know in the beginning, when you start the tenancy, just say, your rent is due on this day. It's late on this day. If you don't pay, I'm going to send a notice to quit. I have to do that for my own business purposes. And so that has been the thing I've seen for how many 30 years here, is that low-income landlords, single occupancy, 2 or 3 family, people who don't treat this like a business. They treat it like a hobby. And you need to, and I've always suggested that maybe the closing attorney on these people when they buy these multifamilies needs to have a class for them. They can charge them extra and tell them how to set up their business, how to keep documents showing the repairs they've made, how to keep the documents of the rent that they've received, an appropriate rent ledger, all these things that allow them to, when it's time to go to court, hopefully they never have to, but when it's time to go to court, they have everything they need right there ready to show the court and prove that they have been a good landlord. So I don't, I think even if they trust the system, they should trust the system enough to use the system and serve that notice to quit.
You also can't get any attention. I mean, that's another thing that's too bad for everybody involved, is that you can't get wrapped unless you have a notice to quit.
Right. And yet then once you get that notice to quit and once an eviction is filed, it's very hard for you to find the next place because you have, even if that was dismissed, it still is on your record. So I don't know. I guess I haven't thought enough about what would be the perfect situation. The perfect situation under the way the world is. But I just know that I've seen it over and over. And even if things are going to work out, it's best to go ahead and serve that notice to quit. If the notice to quit doesn't expire and they get their rent before that, they keep a record of that, but then it's not a court action. So the tenant has actually saved their reputation, I'll call it, in, when people go into mass courts. But just go ahead and start that system, because if you do it, it's like this, you've got another 2 months that you're not going to get your rent.
At least.
Minimum. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. If you do it just like this and everything falls right into place. But that's what needs to happen. But I think it's important for folks to realize, and I don't know if this is the SPOA audience members, many of them seem a little more savvy on the what their business is and how to run their business. But it is teaching people how to set up and run the business of being a landlord. So that I think they'll be less likely to get into really hot water that way.
It's great to know, Joanna, that you guys sent papers out and you hired a company. But I think you would agree that on a day-to-day basis, you're a landlord, you're elderly person in the inner city and you have a 2-family house and you rented out 1 unit, do you have any idea what the security deposit law is? And if you don't, why should you be required to when all you did was buy a house because you could afford it and you couldn't afford a single family? It's like the information is not available. And it's almost like people are set
And
up.
that's why I go back to the person who did the closing. Put the responsibility on, or if I were a real estate attorney, or if I were a real estate broker or a real estate agent, I would say, you're looking at doing this this kind of business. Well, how about and MAHA, Mass Association for Housing, Mass Affordable Housing Association, used to have these classes. They may still have these classes, talking to people about how to stay safe as a landlord, because they had the first-time home buyers, and many of them were buying 2 and 3 families. And so a course like that, and I will stick my neck out a little bit and say, it's not going to be a webinar. Somebody needs to talk to them in person, show them how this is done, help them set up their business. I think about your 77-year-old client. It's going to be a paper business for him. It's going to be files. But for somebody else, it may be that you can set it up in something like QuickBooks or some other kind of online thing where they can have the documents they need to run their business. I have certainly come into met low-income landlords who weren't sure how behind their tenant was. And that puts us in a real bind when we're trying to assist them, trying to get rental assistance for them, trying to get mortgage assistance for them, trying to help them file a case, trying to help them follow through on that case, when they don't even have the records to tell you how much rent is owed.
To your earlier point, and I appreciate that, SPOA does have a diversity of small landlords in its among its members, and a number of them are lower income and or owner occupied. There are other small owners who don't live in their rental properties and they have several properties and several units. But I do think that that direct interactive education is definitely needed. Webinars are good, but they're not enough. Like, somebody has to go out there, talk to them, interact with them directly, just so that they know what could potentially happen. And Jordana, I think earlier you were talking about the challenges people face when for those owners who are able to get tenants removed, when they win possession back, there's this whole other struggle that they have to go through as far as storage is concerned and moving the tenants' belongings. I don't think enough people know about this. Could you fill us in on those types of challenges?
Yeah, so, and I try to tell people, I have something that I call Jordana's fast and dirty rundown of evictions for people who call me. I get a lot of calls from people who've owned property for 30 years and they've never had a problem before. And I said, I wish you didn't say that out loud, because now you're going to have a problem with everybody. But, and try to explain the process from start to finish, and then amend it all the time, because as Joanna knows, like, things are always changing. It was Zoom, then it's not Zoom, then it, there's a lot of changes that have happened, more fees now than there were prior to COVID. But at the end of it, if you've gotten that far and then once the execution is issued, from a very logical point of view, I've done my job, I'm done. You then hire the constable. Of course, I'll introduce you to mine, and you have to pay them to move them out. And people say, what? So the constable fees are not the worst fees. It's the moving fees, because the landlord is required to store the stuff at the beginning. And so the moving company takes a very big fee. It used to be something along the lines of $450 per room, not per bedroom, but per room, per apartment, because you have to think about the time it takes. These people they have a truck, they come, they've taken the day, they can't do anything else that day because they're moving somebody's stuff out, and then it has to go be stored. So I would say the average for a 3-bed apartment would probably be $3,000, but you're talking up to like $10,000, depending on how big it is, depending on how much stuff it is. It can get very, very, very expensive, prohibitively expensive. And you have to go that route, because anything else would be a self-help eviction. Despite the fact that you have a document saying that you won, you can't do it yourself. If you were to use the sheriff's department, I think they charge a little bit less than a constable does, but they also don't have their own movers, so you have to get your own movers. And the movers are there's only a handful of licensed bonded movers in the state, so you have to choose from that list. You can't just, you know, call up U-Haul and be like, hey, I'm gonna come rent a truck and we can please do this on this day. No, that's not how it works. So
The other thing
it
I've
can,
seen is landlords saying, well, do I have to move that stuff out? It just looks like junk. Well, unless they have, I say, unless you've gotten a letter from them saying we are abandoning this property and you can throw it away, you cannot assume that what's in there is junk. And so you still have to go through the process of getting it moved out.
Well, that's very valuable information. Thank you very much. Turning to the future, is there any hope? What can we do to change things? Just to recap, and what would you advise SPOA to do as far as the way we communicate with our members? I mean, what can we do gradually to start changing things between SPOA and VLP and other advocates who are speaking up for the property owners who are not properly supported?
Well, I think outreach and education, and VLP is certainly willing to come in and assist like this with education events where we could go from soup to nuts for the low income landlords. And of course, there will be others in that class who aren't low income landlords. That's okay too. I think if SPOA could set up a, and I don't know, Jordana can speak to this as a private attorney. It may not be something that would go over well, but set up sort of a website or a piece of their website that has all these steps, the steps to an eviction, and the pitfalls and, you know, how to protect yourself in these things, but also how to be a landlord, how to set up this business and how to act straight up to protect yourself when things start to go awry. And then one thing I wanted to put in is that we've seen several cases during the course of this project that went on for 3 years, and now it's still going on, but it's a smaller, only in Boston, and then we'll be in Worcester starting in September again. But people are often afraid of the person that they've rented to, and if that's the case, the police will not help you get them out of the apartment. But it is important to get the police involved so there is a record of the issues that are occurring. In that case, I think self-help eviction would be sheer folly. You know, trying to do it yourself. I think you need to hire an attorney to shield you from someone who may be dangerous to you. And it's not rare that we find that that's a relative, that it's a person, oh, I rented to my sister's boy because he was in trouble. And, you know, so that's the other piece of this, which is showing people how to screen their tenants. And how do you tell somebody don't rent to your sister's boy? You know, how do you say that is
exactly
equal chance, and maybe more so, of getting into danger and into non-payment that way, than when it's a stranger. So that's what I would think, that making the SPOA website a real rich place for education and education videos, where attorneys who handle evictions come in. I also think a good group for that are people who, like Jordana, who have assisted tenants and landlords. So they sort of have an understanding of both sides, so that they, you know, you do feel this sense of outrage, but that's not going to help you in court. That's not going to help you when you start having to move forward and get someone out. You need someone who can look at it and tell you, these are your rights. This is what you need to do. Here are your steps. And when somebody says, well, you know, they came by today, they were really nice, but I think I'm not going to do it. If they're nice with the payment, then that's great. If they're nice and they've been violent, move forward, keep moving forward.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good idea. I don't know about, you know, somebody like me putting stuff like that on my website. I would say if if somebody like SPOA were to put it on their website, I would certainly be happy to endorse it before it's published to make sure SPOA is not publishing anything that's not true, stuff like that. And I also think it's important, as much as these educational seminars are important, I think, forget about me, I think it's important to be dealing with and having attorneys like me do this, because there's a very big difference between lawyers who represent big property owners, because I am like also a therapist. I'm not licensed to be. And when you represent big landlords, you don't go through that. They don't call you up crying about how they're going to pay their own bills this month. They don't call you about how their kids' college tuition is due. That sort of human aspect is something that I think is really important when dealing with how can change really be made, rather than just, oh, well, this company wants to export this many tenants from this building, so I'm going to do X, Y, Z, and then maybe it'll work and maybe it won't. I take it from a very, and admittedly sometimes get too emotionally involved, as Joanna knows. I care. I really care. And I do like to see the human aspect on both sides of the table, which is why this case that I had today settled. Because I said to my clients, look, here's where we are. Here's what's owed. By the time we get to a jury trial, you're going to owe me that money. So this is terrible, but this is the best thing if you want to move on with your life. And just sort of being a little bit practical. There's no judge out there that cares about your principles. So, people, just being more and more practical and trying to deal with treating small landlords, especially homeowner small landlords, and even more especially elderly small landlords, with kid gloves the way that I'm expected to treat pro se tenants. And I've almost never seen that happen.
We need people to be practical. We need people to be caring. And when it comes to explaining the dangers of restricting credit checks and background checks on potential tenants, and the dangers that would come about if TOPA were passed, why should people care?
Well, and from a practical matter, and this is what I talk to my legal services colleagues about, small property owners are an important piece of the affordable housing picture. Everybody's not going to qualify for Section 8 or project-based housing. Everybody's not going to qualify, and even if they qualify, they're not going to get in. The waiting list is huge. But also, people can't rent these $3,000 studios. So the people in the middle there, the small property owners, are a huge piece of the affordable housing picture. And so if we run them out of business, who buys that house is not another low-income buyer. Low-income people will never be able to buy houses again. It's going to be a developer.
Getting knocked over.
Yeah, it's going to a developer, and it's going to get knocked over. It's going to be a McMansion, or it's going to be a big a big apartment development where people are paying well in excess of $3,000 a month. So it's important to all of us, and especially those of us who represent low-income tenants, who represent low-income people. It's important to all of us to try to maintain this affordable housing stock, and that comes from the small property owners.
It's a sensitive ecosystem, and we have to ensure that it's protected, because if the small owners, if the small business community suffers, the tenants not only suffer, the housing stock not only suffers, but the other businesses that count on us, all the tradespeople, everybody else, they're going to have a hard time too. So it's vitally important to help preserve and protect those people who provide not only 60% of the housing, greater than 60% of the housing throughout the Commonwealth. These are also the same people who make sacrifices to keep that housing more affordable, just based on the personal touch that they can offer and the relationships that they build with their tenants by virtue of being mom and pop owners. Does anyone want to add anything else before we wrap up?
Well, I just want to reiterate, I guess, that if a person loses their ownership of their house, their family loses an access to wealth. They lose their access to wealth. If there are children in the home, they lose the schools that they became used to. They lose the neighborhood. And I always point out, I grew up in a very low income family, but the difference between me and my cousins is we had a house. So therefore I had a neighborhood. I went to the same schools. I went to neighborhood schools, and things turned out, and they were having to leave very fast in the middle of the night for unpaid rent or other problems. My life turned out very different than theirs. And I want all of those folks to be able to have that kind of stable housing. And it's the single way that we had of people working their way out of poverty was through home ownership. And the affordability of it oftentimes was based on 2 and 3 families. So I think it's important for all of us to care about this population and for all of us to open it up to help them. We're currently looking for folks who will assist low-income landlords in a lawyer for the day setting. We will be in the Boston Housing Court, Boston Division, and we will also be in Worcester beginning in September. Hopefully able to talk to people. Hopefully people will come to us. We try to sweep them in. Sometimes I have to force somebody to listen to me. Can you believe that?
No.
But I'll do it.
I admire the way you speak, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Jordana, along the same lines, if you are talking to your clients and if they ask you about TOPA, especially, and why they should care, what would you say to them? How would you break it down?
Run. I'm so like I can't even understand. If you look at and this is a discussion for another day, but if you look at any, and I'm sure even a lot of the legal services people other than Joanna would agree with me. Most of Massachusetts laws, the way they're written, don't make logical sense. There's very circular language, and it's just too much. So what would I say? I think I'm a great lawyer. I don't think I'm a great business person, though. So sell your property now and just don't even worry about it, because this is going to be a nightmare. I can't even understand. There's like 120-day waiting periods between when you tell your tenant and then when you can close. Any buyers are going to be long gone. You'll never sell your property. It's absolutely absurd.
Yes, very absurd, very dangerous. All the more reason for people to contact their representatives and to speak out against it.
I have more like feelings about it. Like, whose idea? Why? Why just because I rent somebody's property? Why do they get to buy it? When is that? Why is that even on the table? It's over my head why that's even on the table. It doesn't make any sense to me. And
No,
how
of
does
course.
that
I mean,
work?
yeah, tenants already have the right to purchase the properties that they rent, but why should their right supersede either the seller's right or the other potential buyer who's trying to invest? Why should the process be hijacked?
Right.
So essentially, TOPA doesn't work for anyone. It lets the government basically determine who you get to sell your property to. And it's a disaster. It was a disaster in Washington, D.C. It did not help the people it was intended to help. Less than 5% of tenants in D.C. wound up purchasing the properties that they rented. The property owners suffered. The people who looked to invest couldn't. And third-party speculators took advantage of the situation. So we definitely have to stand up against this proposal. So as a reminder, please contact your representatives. Please tell them that you're against TOPA. Again, you can check our website, www.spoa.com, for our content and the article that I had published in Banker and Tradesman. And I also want to remind you to please donate to SPOA at spoa.com/join. I appreciate the point that Joanna made about how home ownership is essential to building wealth. And we have to preserve homeowners, property owners' ability to keep their homes. And We also have to talk about how to help tenants on the pathway to home ownership. When it comes to TOPA, there ought to be better ways to support tenants on that path by giving them vouchers and giving them other supports that do not infringe upon contract law or the rights of property owners and other parties in the realm of housing. And Jordana, I appreciate your point about the need to strengthen our own activism to go against that sense of complacency that we have, that this is how it has to be, because it doesn't have to be that way. We have to defend and support all the property owners along with the tenants in order to create the level playing field that we're looking for. So that makes it all the more important to donate to SPOA at spoa.com/join. I want to thank our wonderful panel once again. We'll be back with another episode in the near future. Until then, my name is Amir Shahsavari, and I wish you well.